in terms of representation, representation means the idea that political officers are elected not necessarily just by proportional percentages throughout the country, but also by particular districts. And we discussed districts a little bit earlier, but this slide discusses the importance of having this representation. My congressman, I happen to live in New York, so my congressman represents me in New York, even though the person's in Congress and represents the interests of the country in that way, the person's also elected from New York, and therefore hopefully will at least also look out for New York's best interests. So in the legislative branch, congressmen and senators you want them to be responsible for the interests of their constituents, which means the people in their district or their state, rather than just for the benefit of the country as a whole. An example is that New York congressmen can work for the interests of New Yorkers, not just for the entire U.S. Now, obviously, you want them to do both. You want people who are elected from, let's say, the 3rd District of Colorado, number one, to look out for the best interests of the country, but also to look out for the best interests of the people of the 3rd District in Colorado. If you just had 435 people elected from the country in general, well, then you wouldn't have anybody looking out for the best interests of the people in the 3rd District of Colorado. Judicial branch, we also have local judges. Now, obviously, there are also federal judges, but you also have judges that are elected locally, and they also can look out for, can represent local best interests and really make decisions and run court cases in a way that conforms to the will of the people that live in the area that elected the particular judge. And the same thing is true in bureaucracy. Bureaucracy means the government organization, the government functioning. Example of a bureaucracy would be the way the TSA works. You know, when you go through the airport and they make you take out your laptop and take off your shoes and all that, the people that are sitting there working for the TSA and looking at your body scans and making these rules and making sure that there are no terrorists, that they're part of the federal bureaucracy. They're governed by the president, of course, because they work for an administrative agency. But they're also considered part of the federal bureaucracy because they're part of the machinery in which the federal government operates. So of course, if you have bureaucrats, if you have people who control the government from different areas, that is a good way to make sure that they will also that you'll have representation of interests from people throughout the country. At this point in the course, we are going to start looking at the politics of individual countries. And we're going to start with Britain, which is also known as the United Kingdom. Sometimes people refer to it as England, although that's not technically correct. As you can see from this map, there are actually 4 elements to Britain, or the United Kingdom. There's England, which is over here. There is Wales, which is over here, a little bit to the left of it. Then there is Scotland, which is up here, and then there is Northern Ireland, which is over here. The rest of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is an entirely separate country, which is over here. But these 4 sub-countries, so to speak, make up the United Kingdom. England, Scotland, Wales, and of course, Northern Ireland. The British government is sometimes referred to as the Crown, and the United States government is referred to as the government, or states are sometimes referred to as the people. Well, in Britain, the government is called the Crown for whatever reason. Well, probably because in the old days it used to be ruled by a king completely, and so it just referred to as the Crown, and they just never bothered to change that. So the Crown symbolizes the authority of the government, even though in other countries the Constitution is a symbol of the authority. In Britain it's considered the crown, although that's really only ceremonial, because the monarch, namely the king or queen, is only the ceremonial head of state and has no real power. Queen Elizabeth II, who's officially the British head of state, doesn't have any real power to pass any laws. She's the queen, she has a lot of money, she can dedicate bridges and make speeches and do things, and do interviews with tabloids, but she can't really actually pass any laws. If the laws are passed and she doesn't like them, too bad. The British Crown has the government, of course, government officials, people who work for the government, Whitehall, which is sometimes referred to, I guess Whitehall itself is a building or something, but that refers to the people who write the laws, the civil servants, namely the employees of the government. And of course you also have the Parliament, which is the legislature, which is the group of people who actually write the laws. And in Britain, unlike the United States, which has a federalist system, in Britain you have one centralized authority. You have one central government, and they are the ones that actually make all the rules. And you'll see in a minute that there's also an element of decentralized. But basically, the way it works is you have a unitary state, which means one state of Britain, of the United Kingdom, and they're one centralized government. If the several government chooses, what it can do is it can give authority to the localized governments. And it can give power to the local governments, the province governments, the city governments, or it doesn't have to. It's completely really up to the federal government, the general central government in England. The process of devolution, it's the opposite of evolution. Devolution, or devolution, is when powers are transferred to a lower level of authority. Even though the United Kingdom controls all four sub-countries, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it also sometimes gives some authority to these other governments, the government of Wales, government of Scotland, government of England, to do some things of their own. So an example, if the new Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly have been given some authorities by the British central government, but still, so they can be given power by the central government, but really the main power is still this central British government. Okay, and now we've got a fairly complex set of rules. How a bill is drafted in Britain. And I'm going to do this, first of all, you don't have to memorize this completely. I'm going to go through this quickly, and then I'm going to try to illustrate to you what the main points. So we're going to look at the left side over here first. And this process is actually somewhat similar to the process in the United States. First, you have an idea for a new law, the bill, which means the new law is written, and it is first given to the House of Commons. Those are the two houses in England. Two houses are, you have the House of Commons, which is considered, in the old days it was considered the lower house. Today it's definitely the more important house. This is the one that's actually elected by people. And that's the House of Commons. And you also have the House of Lords. The House of Lords in the old days was considered the higher house, where you had all the noblemen. Today it doesn't work quite like that, but the House of Lords is still an element of the British government, and we'll see how. So first the bill goes to the House of Commons, which is the main parliament. The Prime Minister, of course, comes from the House of Commons, so the House of Commons is the main one. Then there are different readings. It goes to committee. Committee is a group of people that look at the bill and see if they can improve it or change it if need be. And eventually, the thing gets passed, or it doesn't. If it doesn't get passed by Parliament, by a majority of the House of Commons, it dies. If it does get passed by the House of Commons, well then, congratulations, it can go further. And where does it go? It goes to the House of Lords. And then the House of Lords can look at the bill and decide whether they want it to be changed or whether they agree with it. If they agree with it, well then they accept it. Then it can be accepted, it can be passed, and it becomes a law. If there is a distinction, in other words, if the House of Lords doesn't want to pass or wants to amend it, wants to change the bill, so then the House of Lords can send it back to the House of Commons with a change. And then the House of Commons can essentially, without going through all these steps, you can look through all of these steps, but the long story short is that the House of Commons then takes it back and decides whether to agree with the House of Lords revisions, with the House of Lords changes. If they agree with the House of Lords changes to the bill and they agree to it, well then that could be the law that's passed and that will be the actual law. If they disagree with the House of Lords, they can try to force it anyway, but the House of Lords can delay a bill for up to one parliamentary session. In other words, if the House of Lords disagrees with something the House of Commons is doing, they can delay it for up to one parliamentary session, and even that they can't do if there are money bills. So long story short, and we can look over here at this chart, the bill is originally in the House of Commons. It gets through the different readings, gets through committee. If it's passed, it goes to the House of Lords. If they pass it also, it becomes law. If they don't pass it, well then it goes back to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons can accept the House of Lords changes. They can reject the House of Lords changes, And if they accept it, well, then it becomes law. If they reject it, well, then it goes back to the House of Lords, and they can either pass the Commons version or they can delay it for as long as one parliamentary session. So again, long story short, as you can see, the main power is in the House of Commons. The House of Lords, really the only thing they can do is they can suggest changes, and they can delay the passing of a bill for up to one parliamentary session, which is, I guess, a few months or a year, whatever it is. But the main power is certainly in the House of Commons. Here's a little bit of a comparison between the British system and the United States system. You can see then this is the cabinets. The cabinets are the people who work with the government on top of various important agencies, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, things like that. In Britain, they are appointed by the Prime Minister. In the United States, they are also really nominated and appointed by the President, but they also have to be confirmed by the Senate. The Senate has to approve if they appoint a new Secretary of Defense or whatever it is. In the British system, they have to actually be members of the legislature. They have to be members of the House of Commons or Lords. You don't have that requirement in the U.S. In the U.S. system, they can be fired at any time by the president. That does not happen in England. In terms of what they do, the responsibilities are actually very similar. They head their own department, and they help the decision-making. They make the decision-making within their own departments. Secretary of State makes decisions regarding foreign policy, and obviously is underneath the president, and in Britain underneath the prime minister, but other than that, they pretty much head their country's foreign policies. In terms of public policy, this is under the British system of public policy, which means public laws and rules of the government that govern people's behavior. It's fairly similar to the US. First of all, outputs play a significant part in the everyday lives of the British, meaning their participation in the economy, and of course the same is true for virtually every other Western-style country. In England and Britain, the average family makes use of two major social programs, health and education services. Now, of course, in the US it's fairly similar, where there's a public school system, a public education system. In England, they also have a public health system, which we don't have in the United States. In England, it's called the NHS, which stands for National Health Service. So in the US, you have to have your own private health insurance, unless you can get Medicaid or something. But in Britain, anybody can participate, anybody can use the National Health Service. So those two things, education and health, are paid for by the government. The scope of the public is limited by the policies of the party in power. Of course, if you have the Conservative Party in power, government might get a little smaller. You have the Liberal Party in power, they might get a little more in terms of government programs. And of course, benefits are especially important for low-income families. There's a very highly developed welfare system, similar to the United States, maybe a little bit more. Britain did join something called, which is something that will be very important in many of the countries that we're going to look at, the EU. EU stands for European Union. Britain joined the EU in 1973. Of course, recently in the last 10 or 15, 20 years, there's been a lot more that the European Union has done. They've created a single currency called the euro, and they've created the Eurozone for economic cooperation. But Britain is in the European Union, although unlike continental countries like Germany and France and Netherlands and places like that, where it's pretty much agreed to by most of the country that they want to be part of the European Union, it's a little more controversial in Britain. There are many British who don't want to be part of the European Union, and in fact there are some people in the government who would like to take them out of the European Union. The criticisms, the problems with the European Union that the British have faced is that, number one, they've adopted the euro as a currency, which I guess in some way could be a good thing. The British used to and still does have the British pounds as another element of currency, and the euro as currency helps in some ways. It allows free trade throughout the continent, but on the other hand, it doesn't give the British government as much control over their own currency as they would as when they had the pound. There's also a cost in that rich European countries like Britain and Germany and France are expected to subsidize some of the poorer European countries like Greece and Portugal. There's also some level of incompatibility of political interest between European countries and the British political interest. People in Britain don't necessarily always agree on the same philosophies of government as do the continental European countries. There's also, at least according to some people, that an infringement of sovereignty interests of Britain. In other words, whenever you join a group like the European Union, you have to give up a little bit of your own rulemaking because you have to agree to whatever rules are passed by the European Union governments. And because of that, they've been forced to create some changes in their government policy. So Britain is still part of the EU, but it is a little controversial and there is a little bit of a cost associated with it. Next, we move to the European continent and the country of France. The country of France, of course, in Western Europe over here. This is England over here. This is Germany over here, somewhere around here. Netherlands, Belgium, countries like that. And over here, you've got France, which you can see is divided up into many little provinces. France has a bicameral parliament, similar to the United States, has a Senate, which is the upper house, also like the United States, National Assembly, which is similar to the United States' House of Representatives. And the National Assembly can overthrow a government through a motion of censure, kind of like a no confidence motion that exists in England, where if the National Assembly, the lower house, decides, the lower house, by the way, is usually the more powerful house, because historically in Europe, the upper house were the noblemen and the lower house was elected by the people. So today, the one that's elected by the people is considered the more important one. So these lower houses are generally speaking going to be the more powerful one. So the National Assembly can overthrow a government by saying, hey, we don't trust it anymore. We want to censure it. The legislative bill process, again, extremely complex, but it's actually fairly similar to the one in the United States. You have a bill that is proposed, then you have a bill that is passed by either house, the Senate or the National Assembly. Then if it's passed by both in the same form, well then congratulations, it's a bill. If not, if they both pass it but there are differences between the versions that they pass, this is very similar to the process in the United States. They will go to what's called a joint committee, where each house will send a few people into a room, they'll get together and they'll try to iron out their differences. If the committee manages to come up with some sort of a compromise, then they will go back to the houses, each house, and they will go ahead and vote on it. If they eventually agree to it, of course, if they can never agree to it, then the bill will eventually die, but if they agree and both houses end up passing the same version of the bill, then it's brought to the president to sign. And the Speaker of either house can ask for a constitutional review, in other words, a review of it to see whether it violates anything in the French Constitution. The president can either sign it or send it back to Parliament for review, although the Prime Minister also has to sign, then the law is signed by the President and signed by the Prime Minister, and then it becomes a law. Now, this is very similar to the process in the United States. I wouldn't necessarily worry about remembering all these steps, but the basic things that you should remember is A, that there are two houses, the National Assembly and the Senate. They both have to pass the same version of the law. If there's a conflict between the two houses, then they get together in a committee to try to iron out the differences. Once that's done, it goes to the president for signature. The president can send it back once if the prime minister agrees, and then once it is signed by the president and the prime minister, it becomes a law. We can look over here for this chart over here, but again, that's really just the main things that you need to know. And the truth is, those things are very similar to the way it's done in the United States. The French civil service is, just like in other countries, the group of people who work for the government. And in France, that happens to be huge. The civil service is very big. There are lots of members of the civil service, a very high percentage of the population. They have different divisions. There's service of the state that directly work for the government. There's the judiciary, namely the courts and the people who work for the courts, public hospitals, and local governments. And the French civil service are huge in France, and so therefore they have a large and strong constituency. If there are, and you hear about this every so often, where if there are budget cuts or welfare cuts, the people who are in the civil service, who would have jobs lost and salaries cut based on these cuts, get very upset, and you have these huge protests in France all the time about this sort of thing. And because of the power of the French civil service, namely the government employees, that really keeps the central government larger than many other countries, because whenever they want to cut these things, the French civil service protests and tries to prevent these sorts of government cuts or budget cuts. The responsibilities of the French civil service are actually very broad and wide-ranging. You have to devote your full professional activity. So if you're a civil servant, for example, you can't work in France, you can't work on the side. Again, something very different from the United States and other countries. One must be moral. In other words, if you have a history of being a criminal, you can't be a French civil servant. You have to have obedience to the hierarchy, which means obedience to the people who are your boss. You can't use the means for private gain. If you run an organization in France, for example, that does, helping, with babysitting or with new mothers, whatever it is, you can't use that for your own personal family or your own personal gain any more than you would be entitled to. And you have to be neutral with regard to religion, political opinions, etc. In other words, civil servants who work for the French government are not supposed to discuss politics, or I mean they can discuss politics in their private lives, but they're not supposed to discuss or let politics influence the way they behave in their positions. Most positions are open for members of the European Union, even if they're not specifically from France. In other words, if there are people from Germany or Poland or Spain who are in France, they can get jobs as French civil servants, but some positions, like the main powers of the state, like police, are given only to French nationals, and about half of the civil servants are employed in the public education system. France has a very big public school system, and it's very, very well funded and heavily staffed. French political culture is a little bit different than that in the US and some of the other countries, and it's based on certain historical facts about France and how their politics have evolved. For example, feuds of the past are superimposed on present conflicts. If you may have different regions of France that are fighting with each other politically. Obviously, they're not open hostilities or violence, but that still may apply today, even if the reasons for it expired many years ago. There's also this idea of self-reliance and individualism of the people that causes a little bit of a distrust for the government, although probably not as much as in the United States. Also very heavy French concentration on the symbolic and the abstract. Symbolic means, you have to read a little bit about the French Revolution and the anti-king steps that were taken by the French throughout history and during the French Revolution and even afterwards to really understand to really understand what's gone on in French history. You really need to understand a little bit. Basically, the idea is that from the French Revolution and other incidents, there's kind of grown a little bit of a suspicion and mistrust of government, and a lot of the philosophers that we discussed earlier, and general political philosophers like Rousseau and Montesquieu, came from France. There's the long, rich tradition of government and questions in France. Okay, union membership. Union membership is relatively low compared to other industrialized nations. In other words, whereas in the United States we have the United Auto Workers Union, teachers unions, etc., in France the unions are generally a little bit weaker. Only about 8% of workers belong to unions, and the unions have limited resources, weakened by this ideology of France of self-reliance and individualism. Unions are like kind of collectivist, where you have many different people joining one group. You have the labor movement generally is fragmented, weak, and the membership is declining. So the idea is that in France you have more individualistic, although still they have a high confidence level, but the idea is that unions in general are relatively weak in France. And these other things are really kind of similar. Business interests, small businesses have different organizations and have different interests than large organizations. But again, it doesn't. The details aren't critical. The key thing is that just generally speaking, unions are relatively weak in France because of their individualist history. Neo-corporatism. Neo-corporatism is the idea of the collaboration, which means cooperation, between private interests and the state. Basically, it's the idea that you have the government, which incorporates advice and tools that are provided by organized private interests that are based on, let's say, manufacturing or agriculture or other things like that, cooperate with the government to make sure that the rules that the government passes and enforces coincide with the rules of private individuals. In general, women have a relatively low representation in French political elites, one of the lowest in Western Europe, not because there's necessarily any rule against women participation, it's just the way it is in France. Political advancement in France requires very strong involvement with the individual parties, and so therefore, because of the fact that maybe the parties are run by good old boys, part of the private club, they don't allow women into the clubs as easy as some other countries. Women used to vote right, which means more free market. Now they tend to vote left, which is more liberal, more social welfare, things like that. Okay. The economy in France is built on many different things. Industry like telecommunications, aerospace and defense. Aerospace like airplanes. For example, Airbus, which is one of the biggest airplane making companies in the world, is partially a French company. Shipbuilding, pharmaceuticals, construction, civil engineering, chemicals, textiles, which means like carpets and things like that, automobile production. All of these industries are important in France, and France also has a developed agricultural, which means farming industry. It is the world's second largest agricultural exporter. I guess grapes, wine are what France are famous for, but they also produce other crops. The agriculture is not as important economically since it doesn't help the economy or factor into the economy as much as these other industries, but certainly farmers in France are still important politically. France is known for wine and cheese, and they also export other things like wheat, beef, pork, poultry, dairy products, things like that. So all these things are important to the economy of France as well, and also to their political system. Next, we move on to Germany, that Central European country with the sordid history, as you know. In Germany, really, the modern German government starts with the Weimar Republic, which is established after World War I, and unfortunately didn't work out very well. It was a democratically elected government, and it ruled really in a democratic fashion. The Constitution granted citizens right to vote and certain basic rights, but unfortunately, it was very unstable because, first of all, there was a worldwide depression in the 30s, which affected late 20s and 30s, which affected the United States also, of course, and also war reparations. I'll skip the second one for now. They are war reparations. They were forced to pay after Germany lost World War I. They were forced to pay a lot of money, which destabilized the country. And the requirements of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was the thing that ended World War I, and the thing that was causing Germany to have to pay a lot of money, lose its colonies, and generally made it very unstable. And that, and the challenge of the National Socialist Party, which of course is the Nazi Party, led to the fall of the Weimar Republic and eventually the taking over of Germany by the Nazi Party, which ended, of course, in the Nazi regime in World War II. Today, after World War II was over and Germany was defeated, obviously the Nazis were taken out of power, and ever since then Germany has had a coalition government, which is a democracy, a parliamentary democracy similar to England, in which different political parties have to get together to have a coalition that rules the country. Certain rules regarding Germany include the Basic Law. The Basic Law is kind of like their Bill of Rights, their constitution. And what it does is it develops a democratic, stable political system where people elect the government all the time to maintain historical continuity in political institutions. In other words, to make sure that the roles of the various parts of the government are consistent from time to time, to recreate the federal structure of the government, in other words, to make sure that the government is solid, to make sure the government doesn't become unstable like it did under the Weimar Republic, and to avoid the institutional weaknesses that made the Weimar Republic collapse. And also, there are some rules that have limits on extremist anti-system forces. For example, the Nazi Party is actually illegal in Germany today. So they have some limits saying that certain political parties that are anti-democratic, will have limits on how much power they can have. You have the federal chancellor, who's kind of like their president, and the cabinet, who is like the secretaries, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, who essentially run the executive part of the German government, similar to the United States president and cabinet, and they are elected by the Bundestag, which is the name for the Parliament of Germany. So the Chancellor and the Cabinet are actually elected by the Parliament, elected by the legislatures, and they have control over the Cabinet and those officials. When there is a conflict, their conflict is resolved in the cabinet. So these things help each part of the government kind of have control over other parts of the government. The cabinet resolves conflicts. The Parliament, on the other hand, elects the cabinet. The chancellor controls the government, but the chancellor is elected by the Parliament. So they're kind of checks and balances systems similar to the United States. The policy the policy-making system in Germany also, again, similar to many Western-style democracies. There is first the policy initiation, which means it has to start in the parliament. I'm sorry, issues and legislation reach through the executive branch and go to parliament. The executive branch is the chancellor's office. The chancellor's office introduces legislation, just like the president sometimes introduces legislation here, and then it goes to to the legislature, to the Bundestag, and then you have in the parliament, in the Bundestag, you have the committee system, which again, just like we have and just like we saw in the case of France, you have two different houses, and a bill must pass both houses of parliament. And if they can't reach an agreement, then committees get together from both houses and try to settle it. And the state and federal governments share legislative power. In other words, they have an element of federalism, just like we have, where the power is kind of split between the federal government and the individual governments of the different provinces within. Now, Germany runs on a system of consensus democracy, which means it's a democracy, which the leaders are elected, but also what they try to do is they try to give the broadest number of people possible influence on what happens. Minority opinions are not ignored even by the majority parties. In other words, what they try to do, even the people that have the power in the Bundestag try to get as broad a number of people, as broad a number of people in the parliament to agree with whatever they're actually doing, and that includes the German cabinet also. The secretaries that work with the chancellor, these are the people that also try to get a consensus. They try to get as many people as possible to agree, rather than just ruling with, a single vote majority. A big issue in Germany that we're going to discuss in the next few minutes is the issue of government spending. Just like, again, in many European countries, there's been an increase in public spending and policy responsibilities. The government has been spending more and more money on various types of programs, and we're going to discuss some of those now. The largest expenditure is their system of Social Security. Now, Social Security is a little bit different than what we have in the United States, which only applies to people over 65 years old, or 62 in some cases. But anyway, it's more like the Israeli system, the Bituach Leumi, which gives money to people who can't afford, gives really a kind of a minimum income to people who don't make enough money on their own, even to people who are much younger. And there's also an extensive network of government-funded social programs. It's kind of like France in that regard, where they spend a lot of money on giving people social benefits. Some of the things that the government is responsible for include education, again, give a public school system, defense and foreign policy, membership in NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which Germany, France, United States, Britain it's kind of a military alliance that was originally formed to go against the Soviet Union. Now that the Soviet Union is no more, it kind of exists to, to settle issues like the Yugoslav issue, the security issues that come up. And of course, the government is very heavily involved in economic policy, trying to keep and stabilize the German economy. And the welfare programs, which are huge in Germany, as I mentioned a few moments ago, there are some tremendous benefits, and they spend a lot of money on these things. They take care of their citizens from birth to death, cradle to grave, as they say. German welfare system is very extensive. It's very broad. It gives a lot of money to a lot of people, promotes job security, and focuses on a wide other variety of different social insurance, things like helping people have and keep good jobs. People's incomes are more secure. That's one of the focuses, to try to keep people's jobs secure. Reducing labor costs. Germany has a very high-skilled workforce. In fact, very often the menial labor, the factory workers, the janitors, whatever it is, very often come from foreign workers, like from Turkey. And that's why they absorb surplus workers. They need to have other people. One reason why there's the unemployment in Germany is fairly low is because there aren't as many people seeking jobs. There's early retirement, longer vacations, shorter work weeks, which means you might need two people to do the same job because they're each working half as long. There's a lot of vacation, very short work weeks, and because of that, you have a low unemployment because there are lots of people that are needed to do the same job. If I'm working twice as hard as you, well, then you need two of me to you need two of you to equal one of me, so there's less unemployment. There are just more jobs available. Migrant workers, like from Turkey and some other like Arab countries, do jobs that Germans prefer not to do, like the menial jobs, the janitorial jobs, things like that. There is, of course, just like many other countries, underdeveloped social plans for those who fall through the cracks in terms of what to do with people who can't make money on their own. There are social benefits for them, but of course, like in any society, you're going to have some people who just simply don't measure up. There's no national minimum standard for all citizens. There are some Northern European countries that actually give you a certain amount of money even if you don't make it on their own. Germany doesn't do that, but the welfare programs are very extensive. Now, this has actually caused some problems, as you can probably imagine, even if we didn't look at this. Some problems. First of all, there's too little innovation in the German industry. Instead, what Germany really focuses on is production. They produce a lot of good stuff, but they don't really innovate and invent new stuff. The United States is actually the opposite. The United States, our production is kind of behind. Our factories don't produce so well, or they don't produce so competitively, but we innovate a lot. Germany is the opposite. They have a very highly skilled workforce in producing high items, but it's also a very expensive labor force, and that's why German products are less competitive increasingly. They make really good cars like Mercedes, and just to give you one example, BMW, things like that. But on the other hand, their products tend to be very expensive because their labor force is they want good salaries, and they take good salaries. German companies are investing abroad more and more. Companies hiring factories in other countries where there are cheaper labor. And Germany also has a transfer benefit social system. You can receive benefits abroad. If you're in Germany and you retire, you can still get your retirement package even if you move to France or anywhere else. And also, Germany has had some difficulties coping with an economy that demands flexibility and change. Flexibility and change means that people have to be willing to adapt, move to new fields, maybe take less money, and invest more of their time. Well, Germans typically don't like to do that. Germans typically like to have stable employment, long-term things, and they work hard and they work skilled, but they have a little bit of trouble adapting, and that's caused some problems. based on the social welfare system in Germany. Some more issues that face Germany regarding their welfare program include especially reliance on contributions. People rely on other people's tax money. If I'm retired and I'm not earning any more money, well, I rely on somebody else to make money so that I can get my social benefit contributions. For pensions and unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits, these are all paid for by people who are currently working, and there are not enough people who are currently working. So, aging population. People are getting older, generally speaking, because there's a very low birth rate in Germany, as there is in many countries in Europe. High unemployment, in spite of what we discussed before, where Germany has the workers don't work so hard, there's still high unemployment, again, because of the fact that there's been, people don't want to, do menial tasks. People don't want to innovate in the German economy. And of course, as a member of the European Union, the government can't just make more money. This is true for every country, especially for every country in Europe, because of the fact that they no longer have their own currency. In the U.S., if the government needs more money, no problem, it just prints more dollars. Well, it can't really do that. Germany can't just simply print more euros because the euros are made by one big Central European bank and not by any country individually. So there's Social Security taxes, which have to have been increased, and the reason why these Social Security taxes have increased is because you have more and more elderly people and people who are underemployed that are relying on these payments for their subsistence. And of course, these problems were also increased by the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, many of you may be too young to remember the Berlin Wall, but the Berlin Wall under the communist system, when there were two Germanys, there was an East Germany and a West Germany, and in the middle of Berlin, there was an East Berlin and a West Berlin, and there was a wall down the middle of Berlin. And when that came down, in other words, when West Germany and East Germany reunified back in, I think, 89, 90, 91, around then, what had happened is the relatively wealthy West Germany, which was a Western country, had to absorb the poor communist East Germany, and that caused some problems because now all of a sudden you had all this poor section of the country that needed to be subsidized by the relatively wealthy section of the country. How does the German government get its money? We've discussed a lot about how the German government spends its money. Okay, great. Well, how do they actually get their money? Well, they get a lot of money from taxes. In fact, virtually everything from taxes. Social insurance payments. Remember all that Social Security we discussed, how the government pays it out to people who need the money? Well, that's paid for by workers. They pay very high Social Security tax, social insurance tax payments, just like we do in the United States. We also pay Social Security tax. There's also income tax on incomes, like we have also. Then there's the VAT. We don't have this in the US, so you may not be familiar, although they have it in Canada. VAT stands for value added tax. It's kind of a form of sales tax. Basically, if I make something and I sell it, I have to pay the difference between the value of the product before I made it and the value of the product that I sold it for. It's kind of like a sales tax. It's not exactly the same thing as a sales tax, but for our purposes, I think you can assume that it's pretty close because it's paid based on how much is actually spent on the product. There's an excise tax, which is a tax on manufacturing or importing materials, a trade tax, a tax of corporations, and various other taxes. As you can see, Germany has all these sources of revenue, which is how they pay for all that good stuff we talked about a few minutes ago. All right, what about the German political system in general? Well, after World War II, this is of course important, Germany was split, as I mentioned before. The eastern part of Germany was occupied by Russia. That was called East Germany. And that was part of the communist bloc. It was part of the Russian sphere of influence. It was under the Socialist Unity Party, which is basically like communists. There was authoritarian rule. It was basically like Russia. It was ruled as a dictatorship. It was communist. It wasn't really a free society. Didn't have a free market. And that was the eastern part. The western part of Germany after World War II became West Germany, and they actually became a democratic country, which is really what Germany is today. They were denazified, which means the Nazi Party was banned and really went out of existence. New political parties and democratic institutions, and basic laws, which created the Basic Law and other institutions that were very important to Germany. After 1989, which is when the Berlin Wall fell, it actually I think took another year or two before the countries actually reunified, but West Germany dominated the process of reunification because West Germany was by far the richer and stronger country, because East Germany was crippled by communism. And of course, that created some challenges. First of all, the social values and the politics were very different. East Germany was communist and West Germany was a democracy. And also, because East Germany had such a weak economy, West Germany needed to help build up the East German economy, which has been done. But of course, this caused a lot of wealth. This cost a lot of wealth for Germany in general. Now we're going to move on to Japan. Japan is a country in the Pacific Ocean, in the far east, of course, east of China, east of the far, or most of Russia, basically east of entire Asia. Japan was, of course, a member of the Axis during World War II, aligned with Germany, but since then it's been a social democracy, and we're going to learn a little bit about them. After World War II, Japan started a policy of protectionism. Protectionism means you want to try to stop imports from other countries, because if you're worried about other countries making the stuff and getting the money and importing stuff to your country, so you impose tariffs, which means taxes on imports, so that other countries shouldn't be able to so easily import stuff into your country. And that's what Japan did after World War II, and the reason is because after World War II, their entire economy, which had gone into building war materials, which led to their entry and eventual defeat in World War II, was ruined. And so therefore, in order to rebuild their manufacturing industry and their factories and everything, they needed to establish some protectionism, because if their people were going to import goods from other countries, well, they were never going to have the opportunity to rebuild their own country. And so they did that, and this helped result in a post-war economic boom which lasted several decades, lasted until about 1990. Again, when I was growing up in the 80s, I remember Japan was considered the foremost example of a surging, up-and-coming country with a tremendously booming economy. People assumed they were going to be the next big economic superpower. In fact, before 1990, they had the quote-unquote economic miracle, which saw Japan grow faster economically than any other country on Earth by far between the end of World War II and about 1990. But unfortunately for them, after 1990, they had their bubbles quote unquote burst. Their economy started shrinking. In fact, their economy for a long, long time was in recession. When we have a recession, it usually lasts for 6 months, a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. In Japan, they had a recession that lasted, I don't know, almost a decade. And there were tremendous problems. They had in negative economic growth, which means shrinking gross domestic product for many years, and Japan has started to recover a little bit now, but certainly since 1990, Japan has slowed down tremendously in terms of economic growth. It's still a Western-style democracy, still a first world country, still a country with a good, well-developed economy, but certainly nothing like people thought they were going to be before 1990. In terms of their policy, well, their foreign policy is pretty close to the United States. They certainly since World War II, Japan has been an ally of the United States. When other countries have threatened Japan, like North Korea and China at times, the United States has it's understood that the United States would come to Japan's defense if they were attacked. In terms of their welfare policy, government benefits, Japan's got a very similar problem to what many European countries, in that their birth rate has decreased so much that they have an aging society. The average age is getting older, and this, of course, exacerbates the cost of welfare, makes it much harder because older people don't produce as much as younger people. People in their 60s and 70s usually like to retire, or at least not work as hard as people in their 20s and 30s. So when you have aging populations, it tends to put a little bit of a strain on the economy. They're less active in pension policies. European countries have very generous pensions where retirees get a lot. Not so much in Japan, and pensions are generally meager, which means much less than in Europe. And in generally when it comes, and Japan, even though obviously things have changed a lot since the post World War II era, they still have basically enacted protectionist policies, which means importing into Japan is still much harder. Like for example, Japan has car companies, Honda, Toyota, and Nissan, which are very famous, and they import into countries all over the world, including the United States, of course. But if you want to import cars into Japan, it's much harder because they still have tariffs, taxes on imports, which makes it less profitable to import things into Japan. There are materials imported into Japan, but it's a little bit harder. Japan has a very good educational system. They have a very good educational and elementary and high school system when it comes to building up education for children. However, their university education system is not as good as some other Western countries, including the United States. Their system, in terms of elections and voting, it combines single-member districts with proportional representation. Remember, proportional representation means you get the amount of votes that are equal to the percentage of vote that you get, like they do in Israel. If you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the Knesset. And there's also, but some elements of it are based on single-member districts, like we have in the United States, kind of like a combination of the United States system and of the, let's say, Israeli system. Voter turnout generally has declined on a nationwide basis. It's pretty low voter turnout. People don't usually go to the polls in big time numbers. In ordinary Japanese are not very politically involved. The Japanese are not as involved in the system. I think the general culture of the Japanese has always been to listen to authority, not necessarily to challenge authority. And because of that, the natural participation in the political process tends to be low when it's compared to to other Western countries. There was a historical election in 1990 that ended 42 years, basically since the entire post-World War II era was dominated by the Liberal Democratic Party, and that was finally ended in 1993. But still, generally speaking, even to this day and age, the Liberal Democratic Party, generally liberal parties, tend to rule the political discourse in Japan, which is probably a reaction from World War II, where of course the militants, the very warlike government was the one that got them into was the one that got them into the war. In fact, Japan has actually a constitutional amendment in its constitution that says that they can never they can never have an army or get into another war. So it's just an interesting little provision for Japan.